Hey guys, today I'll show you a horror thriller TV series named Inside Number 9, Season 7. Spoilers ahead, watch out and take care. The first story takes place on a chilly day by the lake. Near a rundown boat rental shack, Lawrence notices someone across the lake staring at him. He waves, but the person doesn't respond, and instead turns and vanishes into the woods. Just then, someone behind him calls out his name. It's Callum. They've been friends since college, though it's been 12 years since they last met. The two catch up as they push a small boat into the lake. Callum asks Lawrence why he suddenly decided to row a Tesla boat without battery in the dead of winter. Lawrence explains that his wife's friend manages this area, which is closed off to the public during the winter. It's a perfect spot for an old friend's reunion. Callum asks why Lawrence's wife didn't join them. Lawrence says she'll come later and asks Callum about his own partner. It turns out Callum has a same-sex partner who studies art. As they chat, a loud voice calls out in the distance. It's another old friend, Darren. Darren wastes no time teasing Lawrence about still wearing his college scarf, and then ribs Callum for his designer clothes. Not to be outdone, Callum jokes that Darren looks like a homeless rock star. They all burst into laughter and start playfully bickering. Darren hadn't really read Lawrence's invite, so when Lawrence explains that it's just the three of them, like the old days, Darren is surprised since he was expecting a grand yacht party. Darren's new girlfriend, who tagged along, is eagerly anticipating this yacht party, leaving Darren awkwardly stuck. He signals Lawrence not to spill the truth. Lawrence is annoyed that Darren brought someone without asking, but decides to let it slide. To break the tension, Darren claims they need to take a pontoon boat to reach the main party. Everyone exchanges puzzled looks as Lawrence points out they're actually in a paddle boat. Darren, realizing his mix-up, laughs it off. The four of them climb into the paddle boat and begin rowing toward the center of the lake. The scenery is beautiful, and Lawrence jokingly quotes, "3 men in a boat, and they won't mention the dog." Darren's girlfriend thinks he's making a dig at her and gives Darren a questioning look. She likely knows about his friend's orientations and assumes Lawrence is talking about Callum. To clear things up, Callum casually says it's referring to him. The girlfriend, surprised, says she would never have guessed. They reminisce about their university days. Callum was a medical student and is now an OB/GYN director. Lawrence studied psychology, and Darren was into sports but dropped out after his second year. They laugh about the time Lawrence sent them both an email 8 years ago when he started working at their old university, only for them to admit they never read it. Lawrence fondly recalls their wild student adventures, but his friend's memories have grown hazy. It's clear that Lawrence is the sentimental one, still clinging to the past. Darren asks if Lawrence still lives in the same place with his wife. Lawrence admits, mentioning their kid has gone off to college, leaving him feeling like an empty nester. This leads to talk about Darren's 2 kids, and it's obvious he doesn't see them much, leaving him a bit down. Callum then chimes in about his summer plans to take his 2 daughters on vacation, stunning everyone since they didn't know he had kids. Callum proudly shows off pictures of his daughters, only for everyone to realize they're actually 2 small dogs. Darren's girlfriend suggests taking turns rowing, but Lawrence firmly declines, not wanting to lose their course. Callum shrugs and switches places with her anyway, frustrating Lawrence further. The awkwardness peaks when the girlfriend clumsily kicks Lawrence's bag, adding fuel to his quiet irritation. After sitting down, they continued their journey. Not long into the ride, the woman started complaining about feeling tired and sweaty, even asking if there would be a place to freshen up once they got on the yacht. Sensing the awkwardness, Darren quickly handed out snacks to distract everyone. Just then, Lawrence once again spotted the mysterious man standing on the far shore, the same one he had seen earlier. Callum then asked Darren about his current job, but his tone had a hint of condescension. Unfazed, Darren revealed that he had actually quit his job. Encouraged by his girlfriend, he sheepishly admitted that he was a children's book author now. When he described his work, it became clear to the others that his books are basically simple picture books for teaching kids words. Callum, showing little regard for Darren's feelings, bluntly remarked that such work hardly counts as writing. Darren was visibly hurt by the dismissal of his hard work. Lawrence, not wanting the argument to escalate, tried to mediate, but both of them ignored him. Darren felt that Callum's well-paid job made him oblivious to real struggles, while he himself would have made something of his life if he had graduated. Meanwhile, Callum resented how people underestimated the grueling 7 years of medical training he endured, while Darren only played sports and reviewed energy drinks for money. The tension rose, and before long the two were shoving each other. Lawrence finally snapped, saying he invited them here not to dig up old wounds, but to remember who they used to be. Callum coldly responded that college was 30 years ago and they need to move on. As if on cue, Darren's girlfriend stomped on the pedal in frustration, only to find that the boat's propeller was now tangled in lake weeds. Lawrence scolded her, but she shot back, saying she was invited to a party. Lawrence couldn't hold back any longer, telling her there is no party. This was supposed to be a reunion of 3 old friends, and she ruined it. The air grew tense, sinking to an icy silence. Suddenly, a familiar children's song broke the tension. With night falling, they couldn't just sit there indefinitely. Lawrence suggested they try asking the man on the shore for help, thinking he might be a fisherman. Darren offered to jump in and clear the weeds, but Callum, knowing the dangers of hypothermia, strongly objected. Before he could finish explaining, Darren's girlfriend blurted out that she urgently needed to use the bathroom. While she was away, the 3 men finally opened up about their disappointments in life. Lawrence shared that after graduation, he married his wife and stayed in town, eventually earning a graduate degree and becoming a professor. He confessed that they all moved on and started fresh, but he was still stuck in the past. Darren tried to cheer him up with a joke about how even Game of Thrones had a terrible ending, so he didn't really miss much. The mood took a serious turn when Callum pressed Lawrence about his earlier mention that his wife would join them later. He urged Lawrence to call her instead of waiting around. At last, Lawrence revealed that his wife had passed away a year ago and her ashes were in his backpack. That's why he was so upset when Darren's girlfriend kicked it earlier. He explained that he struggled for a long time with how to tell them and decided that he wanted to do it face to face. Since they had all witnessed his marriage, he felt it was only right that they should be there to say goodbye too. With that, Lawrence jumped into the water, clutching his wife's ashes, and swam towards a small island in the lake. His friends shouted for him to come back, but he was determined. Darkness fell, and the 3 left on the boat could only watch as Lawrence reached the island and turned on a flashlight. Darren then recalled that Lawrence had once mentioned proposing to his wife on an island. It suddenly dawned on them, this must be the place. Feeling guilty, they began reflecting on their own lives. Callum admitted he despises his job and had spent years chasing a goal he never truly understood. He even confessed that he envied Darren's carefree lifestyle. Darren, in turn, revealed a secret he had kept hidden. He didn't leave college by choice. He was expelled due to developing dyslexia. That's why he had mixed up the words for the boat earlier, leading to the joke at the start. The picture books he's been writing aren't just for kids. They're also meant for adults like him, who share the same struggles. Callum fell silent upon hearing this. Suddenly, they noticed some lights flickering on the island. Despite the cold, Lawrence had set up a small altar and was tearfully speaking to his late wife. He wanted to scatter her ashes in a way that was meaningful. By chance, his friend saw a pamphlet in his backpack and realized that Lawrence had turned her ashes into fireworks. As the fireworks exploded in the night sky, Darren and his girlfriend were moved to tears. After the display ended, the freezing temperatures finally took their toll, and Lawrence drifted into unconsciousness. Darren, unable to bear waiting any longer, decided to swim to the island to rescue his friend. Callum tried to stop him, leading to another argument. The next morning, Lawrence woke up to find himself in a manual Tesla boat being rowed by the mysterious man from the shore. He panicked, looking for his friends, only to spot their empty boat floating in the lake. Desperate for answers, he demanded to know what happened. The rower calmly assured him that his friends were safe and waiting on the other side of the river. Relieved, Lawrence relaxed. As they reached the shore, the man extended his hand, asking for payment. Lawrence reached for his pocket, but realizing he had no money, he gagged and unexpectedly coughed up a gold coin. At that moment, he heard his wife's voice calling out to him, and everything clicked into place. It turns out the man was the ferryman of souls, guiding Lawrence to the afterlife. The safe friends on the other shore meant that they had survived and remained in the living world, while the coin refers to an ancient tradition for paying the ferryman to cross into the afterlife. As he heard his wife's voice again, Lawrence realized that he was finally reuniting with her. Though his plan had gone tragically wrong, in the end, he found peace in joining his wife, leaving behind a life that had lost all meaning. The second story begins with a new teacher, Mr. Curtis, arriving today at a rural school in Wales. The principal introduced him to the class, explaining that he had come all the way from London. Before Mr. Curtis could introduce himself, the principal pulled out a postcard. It was from the previous teacher, Mr. Kim, who had sent it while traveling. The postcard featured a scenic view of Australia. The principal called on a young girl named Sari to read Mr. Kim's love message and greetings to the whole class. Finally, it was time for Mr. Curtis to introduce himself. He started with a question, asking students what's the difference between him and Pinocchio. When the kids didn't respond, he added he was glad he whale-cummed himself to Wales. The room remained silent. The kids didn't get the pun. The principal quickly explained that it's because Pinocchio was swallowed by a whale, but the joke still didn't land. After an awkward pause, the lesson began. Mr. Curtis assigned the class a project for the upcoming end-of-term meeting. He asked them to discuss what things could impact the environment. One girl mentioned human beings. Curtis corrected her, saying we are not vegetables but human beings. He then asked the students how humans could positively impact the environment. Another student answered it's recycling, which Mr. Curtis acknowledged as a good response. He went on to ask if they knew about the environmental activist girl from Sweden, but the children, living in their small, isolated village, weren't interested in such figures. Realizing he needed to simplify his approach, Mr. Curtis asked if they had heard of global warming or climate change. Unfortunately, the kids seemed clueless, only interested in causing mischief. These were topics they should have covered last term, so Mr. Curtis, frustrated, assigned them homework on global warming. One little girl said that Mr. Kim didn't give them homework to do. This finally made Mr. Curtis lose his temper, saying this could change their future and they couldn't afford to be so careless. After his outburst, he realized he had overreacted, turned his back to the class, and took a couple of pills to calm down. After school, while Mr. Curtis was pinning up a poster of Greta Thunberg on the wall, the principal walked by. Mr. Curtis quickly caught up with him and asked if he could get Mr. Kim's email to inquire about the previous teaching progress. The principal agreed to help and mentioned hearing that Mr. Curtis had already set the theme for the end-of-term meeting. He reminisced about how well Mr. Kim's meetings had gone, and then casually mentioned that the school had nearly been shut down several times. Having a teacher with Mr. Curtis's experience was a big deal for the students, and the principal's praise only added to Curtis's pressure. A few days later, Mr. Curtis had the children paint decorations for the classroom. Sari went out of her way to bring him a cup of coffee. He announced a 15-minute break, but as soon as he took a sip, he realized something was off. The cup was full of tadpoles. He called Sari over and asked why she did it. The little girl nervously explained that she was experimenting with global warming, and that Mr. Kim had once eaten a goldfish, so she didn't see anything wrong with it. Mr. Curtis remembered that last week, Sari had pushed a classmate's face into a cake, nearly setting the student's hair on fire. These incidents made him concerned. He mentioned how Michael Jackson's hair caught fire during a commercial shoot, nearly disfiguring him. To his surprise, Sari innocently asked who Michael Jackson was. Realizing she was too young to know, Mr. Curtis changed the subject, asking if something was wrong at home. That's when Sari broke down in tears. She confessed that reading about global warming for homework had terrified her, especially the extreme actions of environmental protesters. She was scared that the world was ending, so Mr. Curtis hurried to comfort her. A few days later, while practicing a magic trick involving eating a live goldfish, the principal approached Mr. Curtis. He started by subtly inquiring about Mr. Curtis's mental state before revealing that Sari's parents had filed a complaint against him. Panicking, Mr. Curtis tried to explain that the girl had been acting strangely, even boiling tadpoles recently, which is why he had talked to her. The principal then laid out the accusations. Sari claimed that Mr. Curtis had made inappropriate and suggestive comments toward her. Mr. Curtis vehemently denied the allegations. The principal then mentioned that he had managed to calm the parents for now, and as a private school, they preferred to handle matters internally rather than involving the police. However, the principal added that Sari had made a vague description of Mr. Curtis's anatomy, suggesting a way to prove his innocence by comparing it, much like trying on Cinderella's glass slipper. Outraged, Mr. Curtis refused, but when the principal threatened to involve the teachers' union, he reluctantly agreed. Then, a bizarre scene unfolded. Curtis removed his smelly pants while the principal compared the drawing in hand. Just at that moment, the school's janitor walked in. She took in the scene without batting an eye, greeted them, and went on with her cleaning. The principal casually mentioned that the janitor is practically blind as a bat. Then, as if nothing unusual was happening, he and the janitor started chatting. After taking a crucial photo, the principal told Curtis to wait for further news and left. Embarrassed, Curtis mumbled that they were working on an art project. The janitor deadpanned that she thought the principal was just photographing his smelly ding-dong. The next day in class, Curtis noticed the children passing something around. When he confiscated it, he found it was a carrot. Seeing the kids' mischievous smirks, Curtis snapped, asking if it is because it looks like men's ding-dong. Just then, the principal entered the room with Sari, and the timing couldn't have been worse. But fortunately, the principal had good news. After a thorough investigation, Curtis had been cleared of any suspicion. After class, as Curtis was collecting students' workbooks, a piece of paper fell out of Sari's book. It was a drawing of a crowned figure holding a girl's hand. Curtis tucked the drawing into his desk and noticed that Mr. Kim's postcard was still there. He examined it more closely and realized the postmark was from a city in the UK, not Australia. A sense of unease crept in. As the janitor came in to clean, Curtis decided to ask her about him. The janitor replied that Mr. Kim was a heartthrob and quite the dish. Trying to change the subject, Curtis commented on the large turnip she was holding, but the janitor misheard turnip as nipple, leading to an awkward moment. Curtis quickly corrected himself and, using a work excuse, borrowed the key to the principal's office, determined to find out who this Mr. Kim really was. Rummaging through the principal's files, Curtis discovered that there was no record of a teacher named Kim. However, he found a folder labeled Mr. King. Inside, to his shock, were photos of various ding-dongs. Furious, Curtis called the principal to confront him, but the principal pretended the signal was bad and told him to meet him in the field. Returning to the classroom, Curtis found the students busy preparing for the end-of-term meeting. They eagerly pushed him into a seat, insisting he watch their performance. Reluctantly, Curtis set aside his suspicions for the moment and watched. The children began mimicking the extreme protests of environmental activists, gluing themselves outside the Prime Minister's office while chanting that global warming is the greatest threat to our planet and plastic is choking everyone. As the performance went on, Curtis realized he was glued to his chair too. The kids thought he was part of the protest. Furious, Curtis demanded they stop, but the children ignored him and continued their act. One child said that in the 15th century, children in Peru were sacrificed to end natural disasters. So today, they need their own sacrifice. They then presented a poster of Greta Thunberg as if she were their leader. Several kids approached Curtis and glued his stinky mouth shut. Things were spiraling out of control. The children put on eerie, cult-like masks and began singing a haunting nursery rhyme. Just as things seemed at their darkest, the principal burst in, angrily turning off the radio and scolding the students. It wasn't time for the class meeting yet. But then, he noticed Curtis struggling in the corner. Curtis, hoping for rescue, felt his hope crumble when one student pulled out a sickle. It became clear that the principal was in on everything. The meeting resumed, and a boy stepped forward to explain that John Barleycorn represents the cycle of life in the fields, crowned as the Corn King during the harvest. With a smug grin, the principal said he'd checked. Everything was intact, not a cut in sight, before tucking a scarecrow into Curtis's waistband. He continued, saying the king must return to his land and face 3 deaths: drowning, hanging, and dismemberment. His remains will be buried in the soil to ensure a bountiful harvest. It turns out Curtis was set to be the sacrifice. As they casually discussed this horrifying ritual, the principal claimed that their contributions to the earth had been ongoing for centuries. The ceremony began in earnest as they placed a straw mask on Curtis's head. The principal called for the janitor, and as everyone sang their disturbing song, they pushed Curtis out towards the fields. The camera panned to the wall where the drawing from earlier hinted at his grim fate. In this story, we realize that Mr. Kim was never a person, but a title given to the sacrifice, crowned as the Corn King. The name King symbolizes the sacrificial figure, much like John Barleycorn from the song, which is based on folklore. Barleycorn personifies the grain, and the glory lyrics actually describe the brewing of beer. Curtis becomes the real-life Barleycorn, and just as the song goes, his blood will nourish the earth, ensuring the harvest and appeasing Mother Nature. This story, in its most shocking way, satirizes extreme environmentalism. The appearance of Greta Thunberg in the tale adds another layer, criticizing her double standards, condemning some countries for carbon emissions while staying silent on issues like Japan's wastewater release. Once a figure of global attention, she has now become a pawn in political games. There are also subtle details worth noting. For instance, the postcard from Mr. Kim mentions a greeting from the other side of the world. Paired with the Australian map, viewers are led to believe it refers to Australia, when in fact it symbolizes being buried underground. The joke at the beginning about Pinocchio being swallowed by a whale foreshadows Curtis's fate. He will ultimately be buried in the Welsh soil. Lastly, the janitor's remark about her well-grown vegetables hints that they might be thriving thanks to the sacrificial offerings. The third story begins with a woman, Katrina, suddenly jolting awake from a wet dream. She heads downstairs, hoping to calm her nerves with a snack. As the camera pans out, a man named Ezra appears behind her to flex his chubby stomach, seemingly out of nowhere. Hearing his voice, Katrina remains unfazed. It's clear Ezra is familiar with her home. He hands her a spoon and their conversation reveals that Katrina is a struggling police officer, now divorced and living alone. Her nickname, 9 Lives Cat, hints at her reputation for being a capable detective despite her troubled personal life. They move to another room covered in clues from a child abduction case she's investigating. They begin analyzing the case, with Katrina suspecting the stepfather of the missing child as the primary suspect. Ezra listens quietly, neither agreeing nor disagreeing. Katrina mentions that she has arranged a press conference that afternoon to observe the stepfather's reaction. She's determined to crack the case, no matter the cost. After discussing the case, Katrina goes upstairs to check on her sleeping child. She starts reminiscing about when the child was younger, but then she hears a strange noise coming from the closet. As she investigates, she suddenly wakes up again, still in bed, this time from another dream. She gathers herself and heads downstairs, once again entering the room with all the case clues. Ezra reappears, and they continue piecing together the investigation. Katrina paces the room as time ticks by, but she can't seem to connect the final dots. Just then, her child calls out to her from the doorway, and she jolts awake once more. This time, a man is sleeping beside her. Alarmed, Katrina grabs a bottle of antidepressants and downs several pills. Ezra reappears behind her. Katrina questions him about the progress of the missing child case, but he tells her that the case is long cold and that they haven't seen each other in months. Katrina is confused. She's certain they met just a few days ago to discuss the case. She rushes into the room where the clues had been plastered on the walls, only to find it bare, save for a single landscape painting. Seeing her distress, Ezra calmly says he's taken notes on everything in a notebook. Frustrated, Katrina snaps that he has no right to interfere with her investigation. She was close to a breakthrough. At this point, the man who had been in bed with her, a fellow officer called Bull, comes downstairs, casually mentioning their complicated love-hate relationship. His incessant chatter irritates Katrina, and Ezra seizes the moment to send Officer Bull off on a pointless errand. Ezra then cryptically comments that Officer Bull is an interesting guy, though a bit of a loner. Katrina brushes off the topic, asserting her control over the investigation and vowing to see it through to the end. Their conversation is interrupted when Officer Bull shouts from outside that he can't find the tea. Ezra steps out to help, giving Katrina the chance to rifle through his coat. In his wallet, she finds a photo of Ezra and the missing boy that shocks her. She suddenly wakes up again, disoriented. She checks on her child, relieved to see her sleeping peacefully. But then she hears something shatter in the kitchen. Investigating, she finds the light won't turn on, and the fridge contains only a bottle of vodka. A lone box of cereal sits on the shelf, and the drawer holds nothing but a spoon. As she opens the top cabinet, her cat unexpectedly jumps out. Ezra reappears, spouting cryptic phrases. Finally, Katrina can't take it anymore and demands to know why he is always here since she has never given him a key. She then presses him again about the missing child case, suspecting he's hiding something. He vaguely responds that he's tried everything but to no avail. They move to another room, where Officer Bull is already there, organizing the case files. Katrina is furious to find him reviewing her investigation notes without her permission. She angrily orders him to leave immediately. Here comes the twist. Ezra reveals that this isn't Katrina's house. He's actually a writer, and his books are bestsellers. He hands Katrina a detective novel titled Little Black Lies, authored by Ezra. He goes on to explain that after his first book's success, his publisher pushed him to write more detective stories. Struggling with writer's block, one day he suddenly had the idea for a story titled 9 Lives Cat. Following that thread, he drafted a plot involving a child abduction to test whether the characters felt believable. Katrina, puzzled, asks if she's the inspiration for the character. The man responds that she is the character he created. That's when it hits us. Katrina's fragmented life has all been scenes written by this man. After realizing that the storyline was too cliched, he shelved the draft, tucking it away in the bottom drawer. Every time he appears in Katrina's home, it's actually a moment when he's attempting to revisit the story. Katrina refuses to accept this bizarre reality, finding it too absurd. But then the man delivers a blow that shatters her completely when Katrina asks about her daughter. The man responds by asking Katrina if she even remembers her daughter's name. Katrina stumbles, she can't recall it at all. Of course she can't, because Ezra never named the child. It was merely a rough draft, an undeveloped concept. After all, what kind of real home has nothing but a single bottle of alcohol, a box of cereal, and a spoon? Devastated, Katrina runs upstairs to her daughter's room, desperate to prove it's not true. But when she tries to wake the sleeping child, she turns over only to find a featureless, unformed figure, just a body with no details. Katrina wakes up again, this time finding Ezra and Officer Bull standing by her bed. Ezra admits he hit a creative wall and tried mixing Katrina's and Officer Bull's characters to see what dynamic would emerge. However, the publishers preferred Officer Bull's character, so the next 3 books would focus on him instead. This means 9 Lives Cat would be left in the drawer, collecting dust for a long time. Katrina is devastated and, clutching at straws, asks about the photo she found in Ezra's wallet, asking if the missing boy is his son. Ezra denies it, saying it's just an image he used as a visual aid while writing. The conversation ends and Katrina's story is shelved indefinitely. Some time passes. The first book featuring Officer Bull has been published, and it's doing well. Ezra answers a call from his agent, who tells him the novel is being adapted into a TV series. During the call, Officer Bull keeps appearing in Ezra's mind, arguing with him over casting choices for the lead role. After hanging up, Ezra continues working, with Officer Bull consistently offering brilliant plot suggestions during critical moments. Later, Ezra's wife comes home from shopping and asks if he's seen her phone. It's gone missing. Ezra is confused since she had just texted him, letting him know he didn't need to pick up their son from school. But his wife denies sending any messages. When he shows her the conversation on his phone, they both realize something is seriously wrong. Suddenly, Ezra wakes up from this dream. Unable to sleep, he goes to his son's room where he finds his wife crying. There's still no news about their missing child. At that moment, a woman enters the room, introducing herself as the family liaison officer. She asks if the couple has any known enemies or if there's anyone Ezra might have turned into a character in his books. Ezra insists that all his characters are purely fictional and not based on real people. As the conversation continues, it becomes clear that Ezra is the stepfather of the missing boy, eerily mirroring the plot of 9 Lives Cat, where Katrina suspected the stepfather of the abducted child. The liaison officer mentions that in such cases, it's standard procedure to check if the parents are on any medication. While inspecting their medicine cabinet, she finds a candy tin filled with children's teeth. Ezra suddenly recalls the forgotten story and explains that a colleague gave him the teeth as inspiration for his novel. Desperate to prove his innocence, he rummages through his drawer to find the manuscript of 9 Lives Cat, but it's nowhere to be found. Frustrated, he turns to the imagined Officer Bull standing behind the liaison officer, asking if he had seen Katrina's notes. But the liaison officer calmly reminds him that Officer Bull is just a fictional character. Late at night, Ezra is jolted awake by strange laughter. He catches a glimpse of a child's figure darting by. It looks like his stepson, and he rushes after it. But when he opens the study door, he's horrified to find the liaison officer dead on the floor with a note pinned to her reading 9 Lives Cat. Shaken, he goes to the kitchen and sees Katrina, one of his fictional characters, sitting there calmly reading his latest book. Confused and disoriented, Ezra struggles to remember writing this scene. He wonders if this is his doing and demands to know where the missing boy is. Katrina smirks and says, maybe the liaison officer found his wife's missing phone hidden under his desk, and when he realized she'd uncovered the truth, he silenced her. She then pulls out the phone, confirming his suspicions. He's been framed. Katrina's trap has been set. She taunts him, asking if she should kill Officer Bull, or if she should let him play out his twisted fantasies with his wife. The scene is absurd, and Ezra is left grasping for answers. Desperate, he asks Katrina what she really wants. Katrina's demand is simple. She wants her story finished. She wants to find the missing boy just in time, expose the dirty secrets of the stepfather and neighbor, walk out of her AA meeting, and toss her badge into the river. Katrina craves her perfect, complete story, one that's published in hardcover, not just as an ebook. As the tension builds, Officer Bull suddenly stirs back to life, sarcastically asking if he is dead or not. Before they can react, a loud voice booms from the background. Everyone turns toward the sound, and it's revealed that everything we've seen is actually part of a story written by a female author. She is the true creator of all these characters, and now she's stuck, unable to write herself out of the mess she's created. Her plot has hit a dead end, leaving her uncertain of how to conclude the tale. Ezra panics, insisting he can help since his books have won awards. The female author chuckles, pointing out that his published works are fictional just like him. None of them are real. Everything, including him, is simply a creation for the sake of the story. The fourth story begins with the camera slowly zooming in, revealing a split screen of a man and a woman in two different spaces. As an alarm rings, the two scenes sync perfectly. The contrast is both amusing and telling. The woman is delicately relieving herself, while the man casually gulps down a yellow drink. They both brush their teeth, though the woman's routine is meticulous while the man lazily scrubs with his fingers. The woman carefully selects her outfit from a wardrobe full of options, while the man has only one uniform to wear. As he pulls out a gun for a test, the boarded-up windows beside him hint that something ominous is brewing. Sure enough, the next shot reveals a bottle of chloroform, an anesthetic. Meanwhile, the woman spritzes perfume and adjusts her earrings. Once she's ready, she leisurely sips coffee as her husband says goodbye. She tells him she's waiting for a package to arrive. Soon, the doorbell rings. When the woman answers, she's immediately knocked unconscious and dragged to a remote hideout. When she comes to, she's tied to a chair in a rundown shack. The kidnapper, wearing a mask, asks her in a distorted voice if she wants some water. The woman, trying to stay calm, asks where she is. The kidnapper doesn't realize the futility of disguising himself when she's already seen his face. The woman bluntly tells him she had already seen what he looked like, but she wouldn't tell anyone. Realizing his disguise is pointless, the kidnapper removes the mask. He heads to another room to call the woman's husband and demand a ransom. Meanwhile, the woman uses the opportunity to retrieve her hidden phone and frantically dials her husband. The phone rings, but her husband answers casually, barely paying attention to what she's saying. In her panic, the phone slips from her grasp. Hearing nothing on the line, the husband hangs up. Moments later, the kidnapper calls, telling him that he's holding his wife for ransom. The husband, not the sharpest tool in the shed, thinks it's some kind of prank or a game his wife is playing and brushes it off. The kidnapper, flustered by the husband's nonchalance, asks him to have 1.3 million ready and await further instructions, threatening his wife is at stake if he doesn't comply. The husband responds he just spoke with his wife. She's home waiting for a package. He then asks him if he is the delivery guy. The mention of a package unnerves the kidnapper and he abruptly hangs up, but after a few seconds, he realizes the woman must have made a call. At the same time, the husband begins to sense that something might actually be wrong. He redials his wife's number and she manages to answer, whispering that she's been kidnapped. But before she can say much more, the kidnapper bursts in, seizes the phone, and cuts the call. 3 hours later, the bumbling kidnapper was getting nowhere with his demands, making everyone wonder how someone like him could have possibly planned this kidnapping. A knock at the door revealed the kidnapper was just a pawn. The mastermind behind the scheme was a man in a leather jacket. He entered and immediately asked if the ransom call had been made. The bumbling kidnapper replied that he had, but the husband refused to pay. Frustrated, the mastermind took control. He put on a mask and cut straight to the point, saying they were waiting for her husband to deliver the 1.3 million ransom. If he doesn't cooperate, they'll kill her. To prove how serious they were, the mastermind prepared to cut off the woman's earlobe to send to her husband. Before doing so, he sent the bumbling kidnapper out to buy a bag. Once alone, the mastermind removed his mask and untied the woman. It turned out they were in this together. The whole kidnapping was a plot devised by the woman and her lover to squeeze more money out of her husband than she would get in a divorce settlement. After getting the cash, they planned to run away together, leaving the bumbling accomplice behind to take the fall. Suddenly, the phone rang. The mastermind answered. It was the woman's husband calling back, this time with the police by his side. The husband stalled the conversation, trying to buy time while the police traced the call. The mastermind was on to them, knowing they were being tracked, and played along. The husband, ever the cheapskate, even asked the police if they could avoid paying the ransom entirely. Seconds later, the kidnapper sent over the account details for the payment. After hanging up, the woman brought up the issue of what to do with the bumbling accomplice once they got the money. The mastermind assured her that the plan was simple. They'd leave him behind. The accomplice was just an old drinking buddy from the army who didn't have a passport, so he'd never be able to follow them. In 2 hours, they'd have the money, hop on a plane, and leave him to take the blame. it was a foolproof plan. Just then, the bumbling kidnapper returned with the bag. The couple barely had time to reset the scene before faking a struggle. The woman pretended to hold the mastermind hostage with a knife. What they didn't expect was that their clumsy accomplice had brought a gun. The woman quickly backed down, pretending to listen, and returned to her chair. The mastermind tried to convince the kidnapper to hand over the gun, but he refused, leading to a scuffle. A shot rang out. Who got hit? It was the mastermind who was shot dead. The woman, genuinely distraught, rushed over, tearfully calling him a fool. The bumbling accomplice, still oblivious to her true nature, couldn't grasp how manipulative she was. Enraged by her outburst, he roughly tied her back to the chair. Meanwhile, the police had narrowed down the search area and heard the gunshot, likely from just moments ago. They decided to call the kidnapper again to further zero in on the location. When the call connected, the husband asked if his wife was still alive. The bumbling kidnapper, now desperate, told him to have the money ready and then hung up. Realizing his partner was dead and with the husband still dragging his feet, he decided to go through with cutting off the woman's earlobe to send a stronger message, causing the woman to explain that she and the mastermind were lovers and this kidnapping is all they're doing. However, the kidnapper doesn't believe her smelly bullshit and insists on cutting off her earlobe. Shortly after, the husband received the recording and the severed earlobe. The police asked him to identify it, and he recognized the earring as a Christmas gift his assistant had helped him pick out. The police then informed him that the kidnapper had requested a face-to-face meeting at the drop site within 20 minutes to complete the bank transfer. The police suited up the husband with a bulletproof vest and a communication earpiece, instructing him to use the code word if he was in immediate danger, at which point they'd storm the location. When the husband entered the hideout, his behavior was infuriatingly absurd. Even in this critical situation, he tried haggling with the kidnapper, arguing that since his wife's ear had been cut, she was now damaged goods, and the ransom should be reduced to $850,000. The police chief outside could barely contain his frustration and ordered him to shut up his smelly mouth. But the husband's compulsion to negotiate was unstoppable. The kidnapper, losing patience, threatened him, finally pushing him to complete the transfer. The $1.3 million appeared instantly in the account, after which the kidnapper sedated him with chloroform. The woman, aware that her husband was wearing a wire, began putting on a performance, pleading to be released since they had paid the money. Then she mimicked the kidnapper's voice, saying he needs to confirm the funds. Meanwhile, the kidnapper hurriedly stripped the unconscious husband of his clothes and changed into them himself. The woman used the listening device to mislead the police, making them believe that the kidnapper would flee to the nearby docks. She even convinced them that he was making a phone call from the kitchen, giving the impression that they were about to make their escape. The police, believing the ruse, burst into the house, thinking the hostages were safe. As the hostage was led out, the fleeting shadow of the real kidnapper went unnoticed. He had successfully escaped into the night. Upon entering the house, the police found only a corpse with a severed earlobe and the unconscious husband. They shook the husband awake and asked what had happened. Panicked, he shouted the code word. Meanwhile, the two conspirators who had escaped were feeling smug. The woman had successfully secured the ransom money and walked away unscathed. At the last moment, she had managed to convince the bumbling kidnapper to help her finish the plan. As for his fate, who knows? After all, the mastermind had mentioned that the bumbling accomplice didn't even have a passport. In this story, the woman, unable to get a divorce, teams up with her lover to stage a kidnapping and extort money from her husband. The twist comes when the lover is accidentally killed by their clumsy accomplice. Using her quick wit, the woman convinces the bumbling kidnapper to help her extort $1.3 million from her husband, and then she makes a clean getaway. The fifth story begins with a mysterious man's narration telling about Newton's first law: an object in motion will stay in motion unless acted upon by an external force. The scene shifts to student Zach coming home after school and opening the fridge, only to find nothing ready to eat. Frustrated, he starts complaining to his mother, who is busy scheduling a medical appointment online. The tapping sound of her tablet's keyboard annoys Zach, and he asks her to stop, but she refuses. Zach sits down to eat some instant cereal by himself. Seeing this, his mother tries to strike up a conversation, but every word out of Zach's mouth is dripping with teenage rebellion. He challenges her that he wasn't born to make her happy, and if she's going to dump him like she dumped his husband. Exhausted, the mother doesn't want to argue and practically pleads with Zach to stop. The conversation ends on a sour note, and Zach retreats to his room, opening his computer. Not long after, a sparrow crashes into the window. Zach looks up at the noise while downstairs his mother accidentally knocks over a cup of coffee, feeling an unexpected wave of discomfort. Meanwhile, someone picks up the injured sparrow from the ground and knocks on Zach's door. The man asks the woman for a cardboard box to help care for the bird. Curious, Zach peeks to see what's going on. The two adults introduce themselves. The man's name is Bob. Bob has a mild case of OCD, which compels him to repeat words when he encounters double letters in them. After tending to the bird, Bob and the woman start chatting. It turns out that Bob is a physics PhD. Their conversation is interrupted by an untimely phone call, which Bob quickly ends. Just then, Zach comes downstairs, and at that moment, the sparrow suddenly flutters its wings and flies off. The woman quickly opens the door to let it go, but Zach seems unimpressed by his mother's actions. She introduces Bob to her son, who is initially unimpressed by Bob's friendliness. But a clever physics joke from Bob eventually wins Zach over. Before leaving, Bob mentions that he lives nearby and offers to help Zach with any schoolwork if needed. The woman, who has always felt that her son's teachers were irresponsible, is thrilled at the idea of having a physics PhD tutor her son and invites Bob over. Zach agrees, as long as he doesn't have to spend time with his mother. The scene then cuts to a lab where the man from the opening narration reappears, explaining Newton's second law, force equals mass times acceleration. As promised, Bob begins tutoring Zach. He praises Zach for his excellent grades, and while marking his homework, Bob casually writes down the year 62. Zach jokes, asking if that's his birth year. They discuss Newton's second law, and Bob asks Zach about the forces acting on him right now. Zach replies with gravity, the Coriolis force, and him. Bob laughs, saying the greater the force, the further he'll go. The two get along well, and Bob takes the opportunity to have a deeper conversation. Noticing Zach's tattoo, he asks why he got it. Zach explains that it was meant to annoy his mother, but she didn't even notice it. He feels that she doesn't care about him at all. Bob then asks about Zach's father, and Zach explains that his father moved to Singapore and started a new family. It's clear that Zach harbors deep resentment toward his mother. Bob tries to say something comforting, but is interrupted by the mother calling them to dinner. At the dinner table, Bob assigns Zach some homework to research the weights of horses and jockeys and use physics to predict a winner. The mother expresses skepticism about gambling, but Bob quips that if one knows who will win, it's not really gambling. With a little whine, the mother asks Bob why he repeats letters with double consonants when he speaks. Zach is irritated that his mother is prying into someone's personal life, but Bob doesn't mind. He explains that his work in physics requires him to focus intensely on finding patterns, and this habit likely developed as a result of that. Zach's mother says she understands, likening it to how she needs to hear the sound of her keyboard when typing to feel at ease. Zach loses his temper again, perhaps feeling that his mother shouldn't be criticizing him in front of others. Teenagers are hard to figure out. Zach left angrily, leaving two adults behind. Bob tried to comfort her, saying all kids at this age are like this, and he was no different. The woman felt helpless. She was going through menopause, and her child was in adolescence. The constant clashes were inevitable. Seeing her attempt to make peace, Bob quickly made an excuse and left. The scene shifts back to the lab where the narration man explains Newton's third law, the law of action and reaction. The woman noticed a bird outside the window and remembered the box. Bending down to pick it up, she discovered that the barcode numbers matched Bob's name. She realized the man had lied, but couldn't understand why. Just as she was pondering, the phone rang. The test results were in, and they weren't good. The hospital wanted her to come in immediately. Shocked, she didn't even notice when her son returned. Excitedly, he mentioned Bob winning big on horse races and offering to fund his college. The mother snapped back, tore up the box, and told her son to stay away from Bob, explaining only that he was just a stranger who appeared at their door. The boy, seeing his mother's sudden change in attitude, angrily argued, even threatening to go to Singapore to find his father. The mother bitterly smiled, saying that this father had long been absent. In a moment of frustration, she slapped him. Guilt-ridden, she watched him storm upstairs and then left for the hospital. That night, Bob arrived with flowers and the winnings. Zach told him his mother forbade taking the money. Bob asked if they had fought, offering yellow roses, his mother's favorite. Zach questioned if he was spying on them, but Bob didn't answer, to which Zach angrily smashed the flowers. Bob followed him upstairs, leaving his briefcase under the bed. He tried to connect with the boy, talking about the Doppler effect, comparing it to time, slow when you're young, but slipping away as you age. Zach seemed to listen, and Bob asked if he could go back 40 years, what he would tell himself. As Zach struggled to understand, Bob revealed the truth. In the future, they mastered gravitational waves and created time travel. He was the future Zach from 40 years ahead. The 62 inches he had written referred to the year 2062. After the revelation, Bob urged his younger self to treat their mother better since she didn't have much time left. When he leaves for Singapore, he'll regret not speaking to her sooner. Overwhelmed, Zach couldn't believe it. Bob pulled out a gun. The mother returned from the hospital, devastated by a cancer diagnosis. Distracted by tears, she didn't notice the flowers or the money until the phone rang. On the other end, someone urgently warned her not to trust the phone's owner. Before she could grasp what was happening, a gunshot rang out. Bob had shot himself. Decades later, Zach, now elderly, had become just like Bob. He had just buried his 93-year-old mother. After the mourners left, a man stayed behind. It was Dr. Bran, who had previously narrated Newton's laws. He seemed familiar with Zach's achievements, mentioning that the cancer serum Zach developed saved his mother's life. It turns out young Zach, influenced by Bob, repaired his relationship with his mother, abandoned physics, and studied chemistry, eventually inventing a cancer cure and winning a Nobel Prize. However, this change disrupted the original timeline. Zach was supposed to study physics at Cambridge, meet Dr. Bran, and develop the time machine that would revolutionize the world. Now Dr. Bran was just a regular science communicator. But how did this doctor know all this? In the original timeline, Dr. Bran tried to stop Zach from altering it. Previously, the phone call Bob hung up was actually from the original Dr. Bran. As a last resort, he emailed the current Dr. Bran, warning him that their achievements were about to vanish. The time machine mentioned was the briefcase Bob left under young Zach's bed. Dr. Bran hinted it was time to start over, but Zach begged him not to. They argued, and as a coffee cup tipped over, things seemed to reset. The bird hit the window again, the mother's discomfort remained, but no one picked up the box this time. In this story, Bob's journey is one of rebellion and constant arguments with his mother. He eventually runs off to Singapore, but his mother dies of cancer before they can reconcile, leaving him with lifelong regret. Later, Bob studies physics in Singapore, then goes to Cambridge to research black holes, where he meets Dr. Bran. Together, they discover wormholes and create a time machine. In 2062, Bob uses the time machine to travel back to 2022 to guide his younger self, Zach. Throughout this, his partner, Dr. Bran, persistently calls to prevent him from altering history. One of these calls was even answered by young Zach's mother, but by then it was too late. Bob had already taken his own life. Realizing the situation was spiraling out of control, Dr. Bran sends an email to his counterpart in this timeline, instructing him to retrieve the time machine. Turning to young Zach, he lives with his mother and constantly argues with her due to his rebellious teenage phase. He meets Bob, who reveals that in the future, Zach will study physics and invent a time machine, because Bob is actually Zach from 40 years in the future. Bob also warns Zach that their mother is terminally ill with cancer and doesn't have long to live, urging him to cherish the time they have left. After Bob fulfills his mission, he ends his life but leaves the time machine behind for his younger self. Upon learning the truth, Zach reconciles with his mother, eventually giving up physics to study chemistry, leading him to develop an anti-cancer serum that saves his mother's life and allows her to live to the age of 93. On the day of her funeral, a strange man, who now makes educational videos on YouTube, approaches Zach, asking for the time machine. In the final scenes, we discover that this man is Dr. Bran, who ultimately succeeds in retrieving the time machine. The last shot shows a sparrow dying without anyone coming to save it, contrasting with the beginning when Bob saved the bird. This indicates that Dr. Bran has managed to stop Bob, preventing him from altering history. The story then enters a loop, where young Zach argues with his mother, who dies of cancer. He regrets the way he treated his mother and so invents the time machine, only to come back and guide his younger self, continuing the cycle indefinitely. The entire narrative is cleverly linked by Newton's 3 laws of motion, subtly hinting at the plot's direction. The external force that changes the original trajectory represents Bob's intervention. The push and pull dynamic between mother and son shows how stronger forces can drive people apart, and the final law of action and reaction illustrates that history resists change. If one tries to alter it, it will push back, eventually restoring the original course. The 6th story begins with a bizarre old cartoon where a kite gets stuck on a power line, and a boy tries to retrieve it for his sister. Just as he's about to climb up, a wise owl swoops in and warns the children of the danger. The owl then asks its wind friends to return the girl's kite, advising the girl to stay away from the current. The scene cuts to reality, where a mushroom-haired man cautiously peeks out of an old house's window before heading back inside. He begins preparing something, filling a bathtub, setting up wires, and placing a radio nearby. The mushroom-haired man, now fully dressed, steps into the water, seemingly ready to end his life in a romantic style. But suddenly, the radio switches from music to the voice of the owl from the cartoon. Just as the man looks confused, the doorbell rings, interrupting his suicide attempt. The man walks to the door but doesn't respond or open it. Seeing a shadow through the frosted glass, he hears someone introducing themselves as a neighbor sent by a friend. The visitor explains that his daughter's pet rabbit was accidentally killed by a cleaner who overfed it chocolate, and he wants to get it stuffed to spare his daughter the pain of dealing with death. The mushroom-haired man inside remains silent, turning away and muttering to himself that he shouldn't talk to strangers. The visitor, puzzled, crouches by the mail slot and continues asking if the rabbit can at least be preserved. He mentions that he's not ready to discuss death with his daughter. Upon hearing this, the mushroom-haired man suddenly opens the door, perhaps moved by the desire to shield the child from confronting death too soon. After agreeing to help, the mushroom-haired man places the rabbit's body on a table and then returns to the room where he was preparing for suicide. The house is filled with taxidermy specimens, and as he approaches the bathtub, a feather floats down, accompanied by the sound of birds flying overhead. The scene then shifts back to the eerie cartoon. By the sea, a mother and daughter go boating, leaving the boy alone. As he plays, a strange man appears and invites him to see some starfish. The boy is about to agree when the wise owl reappears, warning him that even though the stranger seems kind, he could have bad intentions. The boy with the same mushroom hair repeats the owl's lesson, "Don't talk to strangers," echoing the same lines the mushroom-haired man muttered earlier. Returning to reality, the mushroom-haired man collects all the knives in his house, but hesitates and leaves a bread knife behind. He unplugs every electrical device and unscrews all the light bulbs. Meanwhile, the postman delivers a stack of letters addressed to the wise owl. The man adds them to a drawer already overflowing with childlike handwritten letters. Later that night, while brushing his teeth, he notices a pink balloon rising behind him. The scene switches back to the cartoon, where two children wait for their mother to come home for a birthday celebration. The girl wants to light the candles immediately, so the boy strikes a match. As the match ignites, the man's memories resurface. He moves his mushroom hair and looks at his scarred ear, hinting that a traumatic event occurred during his childhood. Emerging from the bathroom, the man again hears the sound of birds. He cautiously approaches the door but ultimately decides not to open it. He sets up a bed on the floor downstairs where he stares at a photo of a young girl, likely his sister, the same girl from the cartoon. Just as he lies down, the phone rings. It's his mother, and we finally learn that the man's name is Ronnie. His mother mentions visiting earlier but couldn't find him at home, expressing her concern. Ronnie dismisses her worries, saying he's busy preparing the rabbit for taxidermy. From their conversation, we learn that Ronnie did indeed have a sister. They reminisce about a childhood pet cat, though it was eventually put down. His mother then cautiously asks if he'll come home on Monday. He hasn't been back in 3 years. Ronnie asks if his father will be there, and she says probably not. She also reminds him to follow the doctor's advice and not do anything rash. Considering Ronnie's earlier suicide attempt, it's clear he's struggling with mental health issues. After some reassurance, Ronnie reluctantly agrees to visit on Monday. After hanging up, Ronnie falls asleep and the cartoon transitions to a hospital scene. The boy is shown with a bandaged ear, linking back to Ronnie's childhood injury. The wise owl reappears, sternly warning the boy not to say a word. Ronnie was startled awake by the sound of fluttering bird wings. He grabbed a flashlight and scanned the room, which was filled with taxidermy animals, but nothing seemed out of place. Suddenly, the creaking of the floorboards echoed, and a grotesque, plump, naked owl peeked its head out, its head spinning unnervingly. It was just a nightmare. Ronnie jolted awake again. By now, the rabbit he had tried to preserve was starting to attract flies. Ronnie drifted into a memory of his childhood when his and his sister's cat died. The wise owl had taught them how to create taxidermy. First, you cut open the abdomen and separate the skin, dispose of the body, tan the fur for 24 hours, then shape a body mold out of foam and secure it with wires. After that, you fit the tanned fur back onto the mold, select matching glass eyes, and the taxidermy is complete. Looking at the pitiful rabbit before him, it was clear Ronnie's skills were far from professional. The specimens in the house couldn't have been his work, so whose were they? Just then, the doorbell rang. The man from earlier had returned to take back the rabbit. He wanted to talk to the homeowner, who seemed to be a taxidermist, and demanded the dead rabbit be returned in the same condition as before. The man glanced at the withered plants at the entrance, growing suspicious about the whereabouts of the homeowner. He threatened to call the police if Ronnie didn't give him back the rabbit. Reluctantly, Ronnie handed over the poorly preserved specimen, and the man cursed, saying that if his daughter saw it, she'd have nightmares, and vowed to report Ronnie as a lunatic. After the man left, Ronnie lit a match, and the scene shifted back to the animation. The house was engulfed in flames, the wise owl flew out, and faint screams of children could be heard from inside, followed by a funeral. At this point, it became clear that the boy in the cartoon was Ronnie, and a fire had tragically taken his sister's life. But why did his father say that Ronnie was the one who should have died? What role did Ronnie play in the fire? Late at night, the real homeowner returned. He found that the lights wouldn't turn on, of course because Ronnie had unscrewed all the bulbs earlier. Hearing noises upstairs, he went to investigate, revealing that the homeowner was actually Ronnie's father. Startled by his son's presence, the father downed a drink in one gulp, visibly annoying Ronnie. The father casually asked if the place Ronnie was staying at had a TV, and then started reminiscing about his past. We learned that the wise owl in the educational cartoons was actually voiced by Ronnie's father for government PSA videos. After that gig, he struggled to find meaningful work and eventually turned to taxidermy, so the taxidermy in the house was all his doing. Slightly drunk, the father finally asked why Ronnie was there. Ronnie replied by asking if he knew what day Monday was. It was his deceased sister's birthday. Unable to hold back, Ronnie asked why his father never visited him. The father blamed Ronnie's mother, claiming she didn't want him to visit because it might make things worse. From this, we can infer that young Ronnie might have accidentally started the fire during his sister's birthday celebration, leading to her tragic death. Combined with the doctor's advice mentioned by Ronnie's mother and his father's reference to him being locked away, it's clear that the incident drove Ronnie into a deep depression, ultimately leading to mental health issues and hospitalization. Earlier in the cartoon, his father had even said that Ronnie was the one who should have died, hinting at a deep rift between them. But is this really the full story? The father tried to reassure Ronnie that it was just an accident and that he shouldn't be so hard on himself. But Ronnie closed his eyes, recalling the most painful memory buried within him. On that fateful day, it was his sister's birthday. They were waiting for their mother to return so they could light the birthday candles together, but his sister grew impatient. At first, Ronnie tried to stop her, thinking it was too dangerous. So he asked his drunken father what to do since his father is represented by the wise owl in the cartoon. The father, indifferent, told him to look at what's written on the box. It says safety matches. So the father told him that if she wants to light them, let her. Not only did the father allow his daughter to light the candles on her own, but he also took Ronnie upstairs with him. In stark contrast to his childhood, this time Ronnie coerced his father upstairs at knife point. There in the stairwell, he seemed to glimpse the fading image of his sister as a child. It was from Ronnie's own words that we uncovered the dreadful truth. After his sister lit the birthday candle herself, it sparked a fire. Concurrently, Ronnie's father was upstairs abusing him. When the fire was detected, his father escaped with Ronnie, leaving his daughter to perish in the flames. In a desperate bid to save his reputation, the father twisted the narrative to appear as though he had heroically saved his son. At the hospital, he even threatened Ronnie to keep silent about the truth. Despite undergoing extensive psychological therapy, Ronnie could never escape the shadows of his past, even contemplating suicide. Meanwhile, his father trivialized the tragedy with chilling detachment, focused only on preserving his career as a government PSA voiceover artist. He still attempted to manipulate his mentally scarred son. Ronnie, however, managed to restrain himself. Instead of using the knife on his father, he stabbed it into a pillow, resolving to bravely reveal the truth to his mother. His father tried to control him using the same tone he adopted in his PSA work, but this time, Ronnie courageously moved forward, determined to confront and put an end to his past. It was at this moment that Ronnie truly began to grow up. This is Daniel CC Movie Channel. Stay safe and enjoy your day.